You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 372 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm going to break down all the hysteria around Iran now enriching uranium past 3.67%. I have some updates on the story that Mike Maharrey came on the show to talk about the SWIFT banking system and how people have been reacting to him on RT, unless I have a deal being reached in Sudan to hopefully prevent further violence. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. You do this by going to the libertarianinstitute.org, and there on the homepage you'll find my daily news roundup and this podcast featured in the right-hand column. If you're a new listener and like the show, make sure you subscribe to it. I update current events on the show, and so the way you get the most out of it is by listening to every episode. The show should be up at all the podcatchers. And last, if you want to get in on the monthly live stream Q&A, you do that by going to patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus and donating $5 a month. Sometime in the next couple of weeks, I'll go ahead and host the July live stream. So first up on today's show is a little bit of an update of Foreign Policy Focus. I believe that's episode 270, where Mike Maharrey and Will Porter are the guests. Mike's the communication director at 10th Amendment Center, and he had the opportunity to go on Russia Today, RT, and talk about the SWIFT banking system and how the U.S. uses this to influence the rest of the world and all the problems with that, and also how this is hurting dollar hegemony. Now, on the show, we talked about the LP chair going after Mike Maharrey, but after the show, I talked with Mike, and he's now published an article on this that's up at the 10th Amendment Center and will be linked in the show notes page, that he received an email from polygraph.info, which is an arm of Voice of America that I think wants to position itself as something like the U.S. government's official Snopes. The email was very snarky, saying that, well, Russia Today said that you were an expert on SWIFT, but any expert on SWIFT would surely know that this is a European institution and not an American one. So Mike just does a great job in this article going through and just explaining how in every way the SWIFT banking system is exactly what he talked about on RT and in much more detail on this show, that, hey, this is not just some international banking system, but something that the United States, with our dollar hegemony and sanctions power, is able to use to make sure that places like Iran can't finance what they need to finance and, do the international banking transactions that they need to do business with European countries. I think the most obvious proof of this, of course, to counter the argument that, oh no, this is technically in name a European institution, is that if it was, the Europeans then certainly wouldn't have had to create a new system to go around the SWIFT system to continue to do these transactions with Iran. Now, I think the U.S. sanctions have still pretty much shut down and made that system useless, which just goes to show how powerful the United States is, that even when some other countries try to put together a payment vehicle to simply end run around the U.S., a lot of the times the businesses themselves are afraid of secondary sanctions. And so, even if they have the ability to, do these financial transactions, what they didn't under SWIFT, then the secondary U.S. sanctions are enough to just scare them away. All right, so make sure everybody really go to the show notes page and read this article by Mike Maharrey. It's absolutely fantastic. I want to take just a second to talk about some of this big political news that Justin Amash has left the Republican Party. Now, in some ways, I see that, libertarians especially are celebrating here, and there's some reason, I guess, to be happy, and I guess possibly this could mean that he ends up being libertarian, and maybe you have a member of Congress that's a libertarian. But I just want to take a second to talk about Amash on the foreign policy issue, where I find him a little bit disappointing. Now, he's not a hawk, and most of the time when the votes come up, he's on the right side of them, but he really isn't a Ron Paul or a Thomas Massie on the issue. Tom Massie to a lesser extent than Ron Paul, in trumpeting these war issues. And then there's also this Russiagate thing where somehow he wants to impeach Trump over that. Now, I don't know if he necessarily buys that Trump conspired with Vladimir Putin, but certainly any belief in any of it, whether it's the collusion or obstruction, just hurts the U.S.-Russian relationship, which has already been so unnecessarily damaged during the Trump times. I mean, this really should have been a section of time where there was a possibility for talks and progress between the two countries. And in reality, pretty much immediately after Donald Trump was elected, this Russiagate thing starts off and casts a whole problem for Donald Trump to deal with as far as politically goes if he wants to move closer with Russia. Now, Donald Trump could have been Donald Trump, and he was the president, so it's still on him for not being better on it and saying, nope, I absolutely invite Vladimir Putin to the White House. We're going to shake hands and sign an agreement that gets rid of another 1,000 nukes tomorrow. But instead, we get this president who ends up appointing John Bolton, at times, I think, being duped by his advisors to expel more Russian diplomats than necessary. Bolton, of course, leads the INF treaty, giving Trump some fake news that Russia is in violation of the INF treaty, but the U.S. has never done anything about or wrong on that issue at all. So take a quick detour here on the INF treaty. NATO and Russia held some talks, I guess, about this and made absolutely no progress. And it seemed if any progress was going to be made, it would have to be through the NATO allies. The missiles that the U.S. claims are in violation of the treaty probably aren't, and the U.S. has no proof of it. The U.S. on their end is also violating the treaty with the Patriot missile systems. So, those are the kind of lies that we're told for Donald Trump to get out of it. Now, NATO isn't able to work with Russia at all. And like I said, you do have European powers there that see the INF treaty, realizing that, these are the intermediate range missiles. So I think anywhere between 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers were banned by this treaty. Well, what does this do? If, now Russia or the U.S. starts making these intermediate range missiles, where are they going to go? Into Europe, because that's, what's in this range of kilometers, that the INF treaty banned. I will say it does seem to me that the NATO position is changing a little bit. And I do know that there's a new Supreme Allied Commander. It's the U.S. general that's also in charge of Euro Command. And so it may be that kind of influence that's now pushing this more hawkish stand. Recently, we've seen NATO bat the U.S. position that Russia is in violation of the treaty. And also, apparently, there's some rumors out now that NATO is looking at upgrading missile defense systems, which would certainly anger Russia and just feed into the overall new weapons race going on between the U.S. and Russia. Circling back to Russiagate to round up here, Ray McGovern has a good article out in Consortium News, and this will be linked in the show notes page for everybody who wants all the little details. But he's really been following this shift from Russiagate to what he calls Deep State Gate or Spygate, where actually it turns out that the people that may be in trouble for all this are the top intelligence officials in the Obama administration: Brenner, Clapper, Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, all these people who were probably involved in using the Steele dossier to justify getting a FISA warrant inside of the Trump campaign. And so now we have two investigations going on, one by Durham and one by Horowitz. And I guess from the article, it seems like maybe it's bet them this summer, but the Durham one is at least running late. But there may be some good evidence in there that Trump was actually, the target of a deep state, somewhat conspiracy theory, at least to, as they say, hem in his foreign policy. And, since this was going on before the election, undermined his campaign. In there, he has even some great quotes from a congressman that I absolutely despise, Peter King from Long Island. And he seems to buy in now that this was a deep state attempt against Donald Trump as well. So real quick on some North Korean news. Apparently North Korea held a Australian citizen, or they called him an Australian student, I assume he's a citizen, for 10 days after he was what they say spying, and that's what the North Koreans allege. He seems like he's in good health and has been released. As far as actual details go, is this kid a spy? He doesn't look like a spy to me, but it does seem like he was maybe posting some things that would have run him afoul of North Korean law. Not that that makes it right for the North Koreans to arrest him, but I think that's probably where this is coming from. Good thing that he's released. Hopefully, nobody in the Trump administration could use this to kill any talks between Trump and Kim. All right, so the big news that everybody, like I said, hysterical about is Iran now enriching uranium past 3.67%. Now, for people who have been following what's been happening the whole time, including before Trump even left the deal, this was absolutely 100% predictable consequence of the U.S. leaving the deal. Remember, you have a situation here where the U.S. and Iran, and they get a whole bunch of other countries involved, European countries, Russia, and China, come together and say, we're going to impose additional safeguarded, limited, inspected protocol over Iran's civilian nuclear program because the U.S. has long been propagandized and propagandizing that Iran is building a nuclear weapons program, which they've never been proven to do, and any program that they ever had was shut down in 2003. So before this happens, from 2003 to 2015, those 12 years, Iran has a civilian nuclear program that's within the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That means that they have nuclear power and can have nuclear power in the same way as a country like Sweden or Italy or Japan or Brazil. And, nothing that's necessarily weapons, just civilian nuclear power. And then, there's some medical technology that goes along with that. And so then Iran agrees to further inspections and further limitations on their civilian program because they don't want to make a bomb and they're tired of being sanctioned by the United States. So deal gets signed, and what should happen is Iran complies with the deal and limits and allows additional inspections on their nuclear program, which up until about 2 weeks ago, the IAEA, the international organization tasked with enforcing this, certified 15 consecutive times that no, Iran is not trying to build a bomb. They are absolutely complying with the nuclear deal. So that's what the deal is. Now, in May of 2018, Trump withdrew from the deal. And at that time, and actually before this, because, Trump was threatening to withdraw from the deal before that, Iran was saying, well, if the U.S. isn't going to comply with the deal, we're going to start to break some of the commitments that we had in it. Since the deal has already been broken, it doesn't make sense to follow it completely. The deal was supposed to allow Iran to export oil to help their economy, import things like planes to upgrade their fleet so Iranian planes stop falling out of the sky. But what it turned into was the Iranians destroyed some of their nuclear technology and limited it further than it needed to be. And then the U.S. really never lived up to their end of the deal by, allowing all this business to take place, because by the time Obama got this thing all signed and passed in 2015 and was taking place, Donald Trump was already on the campaign trail saying, I'm going to rip it up. And a bunch of other Republicans were saying things like that too. And so I'm sure that made a lot of business very skeptical about investing any money into an economy where all the business could be shut down within a matter of a couple months. As I've talked about in the past, and I know, for the daily listeners, this is probably a review, but I think it's such an important issue because if Americans, but especially if Donald Trump is led to believe that Iran is working on a nuclear weapons program, he may be inclined to do and allow the people around him to do some pretty stupid things. And it's really concerning to me. And so while we did have the positive experience here where Donald Trump ends up not going with airstrikes against Iran after the shootdown of an unmanned U.S. spy drone in Iranian territory, the fact that Trump got so close in the first place means that he really needs to hear the facts on Iran. And not that he's going to do it from this show, but just everybody knowing it's really important and getting it down. So from what I could tell, Iran is either enriching to 4.5 or 5%. It could, I guess, be more in a couple weeks, and they could say that, hey, every month or so that the U.S. isn't back in the deal or whatever, we're going to start to erode more and more of our commitments to the deal as it just falls apart with the U.S. sanctions. Nowhere, anywhere close to weapons grade right now, and so there's no real reason to fear that Iran is even attempting to develop a bomb, just expanding their civilian nuclear program, which again, they could do and still be within the same wall that all the other countries, the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, are in. There's this issue with the Iranian oil tanker that apparently the UK seized and reported was going to Syria. The Iranians just said that's not where it was going, but didn't say anything more about it as to what country that was. So I would say let's keep an eye on this one. Hopefully I'll be talking about it in the coming weeks and that we get some kind of peaceful resolution where the ship is just allowed to go on its way. But this could be a place of contention between Iran and Europe, where these are the countries that really have to find some way to hold on to this nuclear agreement with Iran to, keep some kind of trade flowing and make sure the economic incentives are there and start to develop so we don't have a war between the U.S. and Iran. Now, this is why the information that Mike Maharrey was talking about is so important, is because the U.S. has blocked up a lot of the trade with Europe, even without European sanctions, because everybody uses the SWIFT system. Now, Europe does have this new INTET, I think is the acronym system, that is supposed to, bypass SWIFT. But so far it's not good enough. So Europe needs to find some way to make sure that these transactions could happen. Unfortunately, I think the problem is the U.S. is just such a big economy that if the U.S. goes with secondary sanctions against any of these businesses for doing trade with Iran, it'd be a real devastating consequence for, I'm talking about European companies here. Elsewhere in the Middle East, Turkey is expected to start taking the S-400 missile system within the next couple of weeks. And so waiting to see what the U.S. reaction is here. For those of you who have listened to the show from the beginning, this is probably a story I've really talked about since the beginning. And it's never been a huge story in international headlines, but, has been a real divide among many with the Syrian civil war ongoing between the United States and our NATO ally Turkey, a country that houses, I think, 50 U.S. nuclear warheads. All right, it's been a while since I've talked about what's going on in Africa, and there's a lot going on, let me tell you. Sudan's probably the big spot and getting the most media attention as a very large, important country in Africa, has had a good amount of political instability. The longtime leader, I think Bashir, has gone. There was a ruling military council in place that has gone through a leadership change or two. Massive protests have sparked all of this. There's been some crackdown against protesters, especially under the ruling military council. At one point, I think over 100 were killed at a particular sit-in. The protesters have talked to general strikes and stuff like that. And this has really been unfolding throughout 2019. So we had some recent talks, and at those talks between the two groups, they come to a 3-year power-sharing transitional agreement where I guess the military will retain control of a 10-person council through the next 21 months, and then the protest leadership would take control over the next 18. Of course, especially as a libertarian, I look at this and say, oh, well, now just the civilians and the military gain together to fleece the people. But, I don't know what the protest leadership looks like. And these could be, at least a couple good people there who genuinely don't want violence and want the best for the people. And even if it's not necessarily free market libertarian solutions, when you're looking at a country like Sudan, who's, of course been recently split in two, but, a lot of ethnic violence in that country and ongoing instability, a 30-year dictator now deposed. Any kind of group that's going to bring some kind of honest stability is probably going to be a positive in the lives of a lot of Sudanese. A few weeks ago, we had a coup attempt in Ethiopia. I've read now at least 250, but probably more, closer to 300 people in total have been arrested in connection with that. Elsewhere in Ethiopia, there was 50 people killed in ethnic violence. The article I read on the ethnic violence and the militants, killing 50 men, women, and children, I did not mention the coup attempt, so it could, I guess, be entirely unrelated. I don't know Ethiopian politics well enough to weigh in. In Somalia, the U.S. is apparently now arming more of the Somali army or supporting them in some kind of way. In the past, or in the recent past, I guess, the U.S. policy has been to only give support to Somali forces that were embedded with U.S. troops. I guess this being the only way the United States felt confident that they weren't giving weapons to either Al-Shabaab or just to horrific, war criminals who don't happen to be Islamist. Libya, the fight for Tripoli goes on. This has involved heavy airstrikes. The big story last week was one of these airstrikes hit a migrant detention facility, killing, I think, 53 in total. The UN said that, I guess are somewhat credible reports, that some of those killed were killed by guards as people were fleeing, I guess, for their lives and seeing an opportunity for freedom. I've talked in the past about how horrific these Libyan detention centers are for all the migrants seeking to make it from somewhere, I think mainly West Africa, into Europe. So that would be the other side, and that's the U.S. and UN-backed government whose guards were committing the war crimes against the people fleeing war crimes from a different side. I haven't read anything about Haftar's forces making any actual gains against the government there in Tripoli. However, they are carrying out a lot of airstrikes and making a lot of threats and claims that they're hitting Turkish equipment. So something I guess to keep an eye on in Libya is Turkish involvement. And of course, since 2001 and the U.S. overthrow of Gaddafi, West Africa has become worse and worse. And, with the Islamist violence in Nigeria and the late Chad Bison, and how this war has spilled over into countries like Mali and Niger, where, continuing ethnic violence is like once a week from each of these countries. I read a story that this group allied with these other, kind of Islamist militants, attacked this other group and killed 20, 30, 40, 50, sometimes in the hundreds, men, women, and children, just slaughter them because, that's what the instability has done. And then, of course, the people who say, oh my God, I gotta get out of here, and that Europe place sounds better than this hellhole, end up drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, like so many have. I think just another 80 this past week off the coast of Tunisia is terrible all around. And you have countries like Italy who are now, rounding up these migrant boat captains who are just trying to make sure that masses of people don't drown to death at a time. All right, well, on that very bleak note, I'll end the show for the day. I hope everybody's enjoying it. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute or at Checkpoint Asia. You can also check out my social media. Foreign Policy Focus has a Facebook group. There's the Twitter account at KYAAALE. Donate to the show at Patreon. Make sure you subscribe to it somewhere. And hey, if you guys enjoyed the show and you're feeling good about it, why don't you go ahead and leave it a rating and review. Thanks, everyone.